Welcome to Too Much Music. Today we're going to talk about music as information, music as data.
Ooh, two
What
things
does
that I
that
like.
mean? Yeah, two things you like. Okay. As a music theorist, Allison is largely predisposed to think of music as data. Is that true?
Yeah, I'd say it is true. I'd say that breaking down music into its smallest pieces and trying to
Hmm.
understand how those fit together and trying to understand the patterns that those pieces create is sort of the stuff of music theory. So, um,
Okay.
yeah, so in order to do that, you have to have some common language, some ways of writing it down maybe, or representing it as something simpler than this amazing thing that we all hear and experience, right? You have
Okay.
to.
Yeah. So we feel music in a certain way. It hits us emotionally, obviously. But you're talking about ways of analyzing music, maybe mathematically even. And what's the reason we would do that? I mean, I think one reason you said writing it down. So we want to be able to share it with people. We want to write down music so that we can hand it to someone else. They can take it somewhere else and play it or sing it, right? What else? What are other reasons we want to turn music into data?
Well, in the case of music theory, it's kind of about backwards engineering, right? So we want to understand music that we think is great, and so we have to find ways of getting into it so that we can start to
Compare?
analyze, compare, look for
Yep.
patterns, look for interesting bits and pieces, right? And you can't
Okay.
you can't do that without some sort of probably visual representation in the case of most, human music theorists.
Okay. And this is interesting because we are very interested in the coming AI, right? In music and in all things that we do. So that's another important point, right? That we can use if we can get music into some kind of data format, we can then hand it to computers, and computers can do interesting things with it.
Right, and we've actually gone a long way toward that just for ourselves as people, right? And creating music notation,
Hmm.
it does give us a pretty darn good start on that because we have a way of representing uh, a lot of the elements of music, certainly not all of them, in a very clear manner, akin to
Okay.
writing
Well,
text.
because you're kind of really into this, maybe you can take us through a bit of the history of how this came to be, because this is not modern, right? This started a long time ago.
Are you really asking me to go into the history? How
A
long do
little
we
bit.
have?
Okay. A little bit. Let's
Okay,
keep it jaunty and
fine.
interesting.
Jaunty. I'll try to be jaunty
Uh-huh.
when talking about Gregorian chant and neumes. Ooh, what? Are we really going back that far?
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
so that
Okay.
is about how far to go back if you want to talk about Western music notation,
So ninth
which is
century.
indeed the ninth. Very
Okay.
good, very good. You
Hey, it's
remember,
Gregorian chant is my namesake.
Gregor. Um,
Yeah.
that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. Um,
I mean,
I
here's
doubt
what
that's
I
what
know
your.
about it, right? So I know that with Gregorian chant, like basically the church was having a problem getting people to sing the same music everywhere, right? So they needed to find a way to codify it and to be able to say, this is what God intends. And so they would, right? So they had to somehow transport this. So maybe take it from there, right? They had to get
Yeah,
everybody on the same page.
that's right, and they did this by creating a very simple spatial system. So the unit in this case was called the neume, and that meant just everything sung on a single syllable. So amen, everything sung on men, which may be one note or maybe more than one note pitch, was a neume, and it actually comes from. It might come from the word for breath and it might come from
Ah,
the word for sign, both of which are really cool. So anyway,
oh
just
my God, you're
that
geeking out here.
nerds me
Okay,
out.
that's fine. Okay.
Um, yeah, so it could only really give you some very basic information. This is the important part about it in the context of what we're talking about. It couldn't really tell you everything about the music at all, and in fact, the written the written notation at that time could not really carry the music completely. It still had to be orally shown to someone. But if you had
Hmm.
both, So it's more of a reminder system than
Okay, so it was
uh,
just a basic outline, but you couldn't really, you didn't know exactly how to perform it from just looking at the neumes.
that's right. You needed to hear someone else sing it before you could sing it exactly like them, despite having this very basic notation. So
Okay.
that lasted actually a long time, 200 to 300 years, and that's how it was done, and it worked pretty well. But then along came our best friend in music theory, who we all learn about in freshman theory, Guido of Arezzo. This was in the
Uh-huh.
12th century, so the 1100s. Um, he was very famous for the Guidonian hand, but we won't go into that. Look it up if you're, wanting to find some fun historical facts. Maybe the more important thing that Guido did historically was he greatly improved the notation system. It's not as fun a picture as the Guidonian hand, but basically he created new ways to write melodies. He created the staff, the musical staff, which
Yep.
obviously has been extremely important ever since. And that means you could see now it's a better spatial model. You can see size and distance and direction of any interval. So
Okay.
you have more capabilities for rhythmic notation, um, and it also is better at transmitting music without any oral tradition coming into it. So you don't necessarily. I mean, you still did have to hear it. It still wasn't a complete notation system, but it did really change things. And of course, he wasn't the only one. There were other people making improvements, but he's kind of credited as a major innovator in that history.
Okay.
And then heading into Renaissance polyphony and into the Ars Nova in the 14th century, basically these improvements just kept happening. So incremental improvements went on and on. Mostly pitches were kind of done, and well covered by about the 12th century, but then rhythm became better and better. So
And in terms of like, if you had a group of instrumentalists or singers or whatever, like having a score, right, where lots of parts were being, put down, written down, so we know how it sounded as a whole. Was that happening around then as well?
yes, it was, and that was. I mean, polyphony means lots of things happening at the same time, basically.
Sure.
So, yeah, that was very important for that type of music to to
If I
have.
if I remember correctly, right, during Guido's time, they were part books or something, right? For the this is 30 years ago in music history, but part books where every different the bass, the tenor, the whatever, the different vocal parts would have their own book with their own line in it, but there wasn't necessarily a full score that was always
Putting it
present.
together. Yeah, that is true. And obviously, that innovation created a whole new opportunity for someone to understand music as a whole. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're studying a symphony today, you're not going to probably be looking at any of the individual part books, or any of the individual parts, right? You're looking at the entirety of the score to see what's going on. So um, that was a super important innovation. Um, and by the 14th century, pretty much modern notation existed. All the bedrock for it was there. And
Okay.
at that point, that's when we were able to take a piece of music from one place to the other on paper, and the person at the other end could perform basically the same thing. So it took
And they would
500
know
years.
that they would know they were performing the same thing, even if they hadn't met the composer.
They hadn't met the composer, they hadn't heard anyone sing or play the piece, but they had the necessary elements on paper
Okay.
to
So, and these
perform the
elements
piece.
these elements are pitch, of course, rhythm, things like tempo. What about dynamics, right? And even how to shape a phrase.
Well, so that actually became, those sorts of what I would call timbral elements, came into play later, really. That wasn't happening in the 14th century because that wasn't a part of how people were thinking about performing music. That
Okay.
starting in the classical is where that really super took off, right? Classical music and romantic
So
music have.
okay, so this is why, like with Bach, we have keyboard music, meaning it can be played on basically any keyboard, although the performance. There was no modern piano then, so we have to adapt what we do on the modern piano to the notes and rhythms that we get from Bach, right? Whereas a more modern composition will have very specific techniques and timbral requirements, right, written down. So, and even extended techniques for different instruments, right? So for like a modern violin piece, there will be very specific ways that you might hold the bow or turn the bow upside down or put mutes on the strings or different things to get very specific sounds out of the instrument, which is that's even another level of data in terms of how you're representing what's ultimately going to come from the instrument.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that points to something that's become just increasingly important and is really interesting in music history. That early on, and again, I don't know that much about non-Western music theory, so I can really only speak to the European tradition. But early on, you couldn't really dictate as a composer what sounds were going to be made, right? You could dictate the notes and the rhythms through these notation systems we've been talking about, but it just wasn't part of the thinking that you were going to be dictating timbre or prescribing what the sound was going to be. It may be in a
Mm-hmm.
range. It's keyboard music. That makes sense. A little later on, it's vocal music. So I have always thought that that comes from the fact that, you know, people's voices sound the way they sound. And there's, not compared to the range of all possible sounds that we can hear, there's not a lot of variation in vocal sounds. A woman over here and a woman over here don't sound that different when you compare them to the sound of a car horn, right? They're very similar.
So, okay, but then there's another thing that happens, right? Especially with non-Western music, okay? At least because we're talking about a Western history here, writing down Western music. But I do know that when with the birth of ethnomusicology is what it was called, or what it is called, where Western scholars would travel to other places and hear new music, gamelan or the Bulgarian women's choir or whatever. Like you would hear these other musics, and they would try to write it down. And the difficulties are many because you don't always have ways to write down what's important in this other music that you're hearing. It's also hard for a Westerner to know, in many cases, it was impossible for them to know what was important. In other words, there might be vocal flips and flares and detunings and all sorts of things that are happening in a performance. The question is that part of what I need to write down, or is that just the way that person performs?
Right.
Um,
I mean, a simple example of that is just the difference in pitch space, right? So we divide our octaves into 12, but other places divide them into different numbers and use
mhm.
notes, what we would think of as notes between notes. And so our Western notation system absolutely fails at that moment because it is
Okay.
completely predicated on, 12 notes per octave and that's it. So,
Yeah.
um,
And we want to capture that information because it often is important to capturing the essence of the music that we're hearing. And then to even complicate things further, when computers, like in the 40s and 50s, really the 50s, when computers or machines started to enter the musical world in the West, there wasn't a way to record how do you play this siren. There's a crank on the siren and it's going to make a noise that we want. But how do you perform? How do you write that down? If I use electronic, machines that generate noise, how do I can't just write down the dial settings because everybody's going to have different machines or different calibrations to those machines. So we had to find a way to do that. I think probably the best example is an early thing, which is Stockhausen. He would take great pains to write down how he produced electronic sounds in his studio, almost like a recipe book, like an instruction manual of how each sound was made, and how the tape was manipulated physically in order to achieve, so that it could be replicable, right?
yeah,
Um,
I've been experiencing that in my studio recently. You know, musicians right now are mostly using a software called a digital audio workstation or a DAW to record and make music. And
mhm.
it carries a lot of benefits in that it's kind of remembering a lot of things for you, right? So when you call up a session, it has maybe all your instruments, it has all the notes that you played as information, again, as data on the screen,
Mm.
and in the right order. And it has, if you change the volume over time, you can see that in a line, like a little graph. All of these things are remembered for you. But if you don't have that, right, like Stockhausen didn't have that, and you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to make music just completely outside of the computer, like I've been doing, you instantly have to create some sort of information system for that. Because if you don't, you'll never be
Yeah.
able to get back to where you were. You'll never make that piece of music again. You'll never be able to work on it again. It's a very
And
visceral challenge to me right now.
well, and not just being able to recall all of that, but ostensibly this is all part of the emotional impact that your music is going to have. So if you're trying to capture music as data, you need a lot more. What we're getting here, I think, is you need a lot more than just pitch and rhythm. You need the sonic, timbral aspects of it, and you want to capture all that because that stuff holds emotion for us. But I think there's more to it than that, even, because we need to capture like the feel of a performance beyond all of that, right? We don't just want to recall all these specifics in terms of your instruments. We want to get, if you're playing a part or I'm playing a part, we're going to do it differently. We're going to have a different vibe, right,
No,
to
this
it.
is interesting. I'm going to ask a question because, I mean, why would we need to capture that when the essence of music is what we experience when we hear it, right? It's these wonderful or mediocre or whatever. The feelings that we get, whatever it is, it's interacting with our ears and to our brains and doing all kinds of magical stuff that we're just barely starting to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So, why would we need? So, if we have enough information for people to perform music that was already written,
Mm-hmm. Repeat
and
it.
if we have enough information to repeat the music, and now we have recordings, so like, I mean, when you think about the perfect music information for humans, I mean, a recording is perfect. It literally
Yeah,
creates a replica
it should be.
of what was happening.
Yeah.
Well, should. I
So
mean, yeah, so why would we need more? Why do we need to understand more than that?
Well, so even in a recording, right, a stereo or monophonic recording, the way you normally you ingest it, but you hear the recording, you experience it. Um, you're not capturing what really it feels like in the live situation, which is why people still love to go and hear live music, because there is stuff happening in those spaces and with the performance in the moment that we want to capture. Why? Because if we want a machine, a computer, or an AI system to understand the aspects of music that we value, we need to capture those feelings as best we can. And
Hmm.
it's of the moment in live performance, but also the differences in individual players, because clearly we don't go hear a specific drummer um, because we just want to hear them replicate the same drumming patterns we've heard before. We want to hear the way they twist and turn it in the moment, the way they very subtly. It's weird. We are so attuned to these micro movements, micro timing, for example. That's part of your scholarship, but the way in which these very subtle movements in time, for example, or pitch or whatever, dynamic and whatever, they change the overall experience and provide us like a real unity and identity of a performer, which we care about, right?
Yeah.
So we want machines to capture that so that the machines can better understand how that works so that they can do interesting things with the things in music that we value. It's a real
Hmm.
challenge, right?
Yeah. So, well, let's think about something like micro timing. You brought that up. So, when we say that, we're just talking about exactly what it sounds like, very tiny bits of time that in music actually make a huge, huge difference. So, we're talking about millisecond shifts.
Well, maybe it's worth noting that, like a computer, if you put in a series of eighth notes, bop, 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 a computer, of course, can precisely replicate that on a grid that is mathematically exact. No human could ever do that. You wouldn't want a human to do that. So just because a computer can do it and it's good at doing it, it's easier for it to really do that. We don't, that's great, but we really want it to capture all those subtle changes that happen when a person might be trying to make it exact, or maybe they're trying to give it a little feel. Maybe they're trying to put a little bit of feel against another part, right? So my piano part, my piano notes I may want them to rush a little bit against that drummer's hi-hat or the bass player or whatever. And all of that micro timing or micro differences really add up to personality. Is that
Hmm.
fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just read a really interesting article to that effect,
Mm-hmm.
where the authors were looking at some professional drummers and how they are able to, and at what level they're able to shift themselves when asked to play in different sorts of grooves, and it's really almost inhuman, what they can do.
And of course, they're intuiting this, right? This is something that's, well, they're not calculating this out. But for a computer to capture it accurately, it has to, I mean, it only works in calculations, ones and zeros. So we have to somehow codify this, and not just codify the thing that happened, but the patterns, the tendencies of a player, right? Um, in fact, I would go so far as to say, like, I can write down, as we were talking about notation, I can write down what that drummer is doing in notation, which is representing it as if it were perfect.
Hmm.
But the difference between what I've written down and what the recording is from that drummer is, the difference between those two is significant, and it is the drummer, the identity of the drummer that we're capturing here. Or maybe said another way, we can take a score from Bach, we can have 5 people interpret that score and perform it. They will all sound different and feel different. And the difference between the score and the performance, or the individual performances, it comes down to the essence of that human. And I know it sounds a little esoteric and abstract, but that's what we really want to capture when we're looking at music as data. Ultimately, for a computer, we want to capture that feeling of humanness, humanity, right? We want to capture that identity and understand what that is in terms of numbers, so that the computer can do interesting things with it, whether it's replicating more versions of that person's musical identity, or creating a mood from that person's feel. Right? There's all kinds of applications for that, but we want to capture that. That's the key, and it's challenging to do.
Yeah, so that's something I know you've spent an awful lot of time trying to figure out, is, how to take, for example, an audio file, which is frankly kind of a mess of information.
Yeah.
When you compare it perceptually, we have a very easy time listening to, a track of music in headphones and picking out the different instruments, for example, and understanding what's happening musically. But that's not so for a computer. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and the challenges inherent in that, and some of the interesting things that you found over the years?
Well, ultimately, there are a number of ways to do it. The first is that you have to represent the data in a way, the musical data, in a way that can be seen at scale, so that you can extrapolate trends and tendencies from them, and from that data. That's tricky because there's a lot of information in music. Most of it we actually don't really care too much about, meaning it's not that valuable to understanding the core of that performer's identity or that composer's identity, their characteristics. So we have to select out the parts that matter, and then we have to identify examples of prototypical examples of what that performer does in certain musical contexts. And musical context is a huge part of this. Is a huge subject which we can talk about for years, but developing a musical context is the key, and then understanding how someone works within that context is the secondary piece of it. So when you look at, like, the big rage at the moment, of course, are these LLM systems, these large language models that are producing really interesting and very it feels like understanding in text models. you can't do that same thing with music, because the way that those models work, they are looking at statistical likelihood of words in order. That's fine, but we can do that with music, except we won't capture all of that human identity and character that we want. That requires some other work around the process in order to capture it. So that's
Hmm.
a
Do you think this is related to? I've put a lot of thought into why music doesn't work when you just shove it into an LLM, in little blocks, which it doesn't. I mean, it
yeah,
does to an extent. It actually works amazingly well, but you don't get human music. You don't get music people would want to hear and listen to today.
no.
Um,
No, unlike the text, right? The text sounds a bit like you're talking with a person, or, it seems to have an understanding, and it seems to have its own personality sometimes when you're talking, but you don't get that with the musical examples at all.
yeah. So um, is there, when you look at the history of languages, of written languages, um, like music, it starts with kind of this proto writing or proto language that's just sort of gesturing at the thing, and it's not the real thing,
Uh-huh.
right? So pictographs and things like that,
Yep.
and then any writing system will evolve to become what people have called true writing, or something that really, really represents conceptually. And this is evolved to be phonetic writing, right? And almost in
Hmm.
most languages, we have phonetic writing, and it gives you all the little tools that you need to put together to make these concepts. And it's a very close approximation of what we want to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll leave it to the linguists to argue about that, but it's pretty darn good, and I would say it's much better at that than music notation has ever gotten.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have, and part of it is just the different nature of music to language, right? So um, I'm not sure if you could ever have a notation system as perfect. Certainly wouldn't be written down on paper as perfect as writing is for speaking. Um, but that difference, I think, is crucial to why it's very difficult to use a computer to generate music, for example.
Well, so there are several things going on here. Music is an abstract language. It's an emergent grammar. So when we are speaking with language that we learn as children, we all accept the grammatical rules that are in place, and we can bend them. And it's interesting, of course, linguists study how children acquire language, how they understand and learn those rules by listening to adults, and the ways in which they bend and break those rules, which makes kids say funny things in funny ways. But those are basically accepted. There's a lexicon. There's an accepted way in which we put words together to create meaning, but that's not true in music. Music is an emergent grammar. So while there's a history to music that we might depend very heavily on to communicate a certain thing, and we're making reference to that stuff that we're familiar with, the truth is every piece of music really is its own genre. Every piece of music that exists is setting its own rules and expectations. There are, I think, some universals in our cognition that, so you can't just do anything and call it music. We won't hear it as such. We'll have, to a certain or lesser degree, we'll have difficulty making music out of noise. And this is, again, another big topic for the for a future
Yeah.
episode maybe, but there are limits to how that all works, but they're not all agreed upon culturally or individually, or in any respect like that. So music is an emergent grammar. It makes it much more challenging to
Hmm.
train a machine to understand music, understand meaning in music or mood, understand identity of individual performers, and also to create interesting music that we would see as interesting and novel, and that it has personality. That's maybe the most important part.
Wow. So you're saying that music there may be some basic cognitive expectations that we have for how it behaves. Um, and obviously there are some cultural norms that have developed for different types of music,
Mm-hmm.
and those generate expectations.
Yep,
but that every time a different piece of music begins, it is crafting its own set of rules that it follows. Is
it
that
is. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. That's a really good, much more succinct way than I did of saying it. So we're trained on these
yes?
things. When we hear like movie music or whatever, like the reason that works and it's emotional to us is because it's referencing all these things that have existed and that are fairly agreed upon in culture. But if you were to watch, foreign, a foreign culture, if you were watching TV or movies from a foreign culture, it might be a little more difficult to immediately get the references musically that they're making or the emotional cues that you're supposed to get. And that's another episode, maybe
Yeah.
semiotics in music. But the idea of being trained about what certain sounds and what different intervals mean and how they're supposed to make us feel, we get trained on this culturally just by being alive in our culture. So those are touchstones that you can use in a system to help understand what mood is. But I think it's far more interesting and far more effective to develop a system, a computer system that is agnostic to these things, but finds these identifiable trends and patterns anyway. It doesn't always have to know how you were trained to experience them. It knows that, oh, these are similarities that matter. And when I put them together, they create an effect, right?
So that sounds really similar to how, a music theorist might think of
Hmm.
looking at a piece of music, actually.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
because when you get good at at doing theory, which theorists laugh at when you call it that, I'm doing theory right now. Um, when
Uh-huh.
you get good at it, what happens is you don't have to think about, you spend all this time as a young musician learning
Hmm.
rules, what feel like rules that you're learning. You learn to write
Yeah.
block chorales, you learn, all this stuff in your music theory 1, 2, 3, and 4 classes, and then you go to grad school and you learn even more things. You might learn Shakarian analysis, and you learn all these ways to do theory. But then what happens is you realize that none of those actually ever were rules, right? Which is, I think, what you're saying.
Hmm.
They were all only conventions and things that happened that people seemed to like. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you're doing theory, really, what you're actually doing is letting all those things sit in the background, right, of
Mm-hmm.
your brain, because you know all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You've studied it, you understand it, and it sits in the background. And then you just look at what you're seeing or hearing, both actually, usually, and try to find these patterns and you know, these relationships that may not be on the surface that can bring out interesting things about the music.
Yeah.
And in theory, that's the end of it. Like that's that's the whole point, right? So what can we do more than that with computers? I mean, why bring computers in, and what can we do with them that we can't do just sitting, with our pencils and our staff paper?
Hmm. So that remains to be seen, I think. I know this is the path that I have embarked upon. I've been looking for ways to use this again to capture the feel and identity, the essence, really, of either individual composers or individual performers. I want the computer to be able to capture that, so that it can live on, so that that it can create variation that might likely be from that person or people. In other words, to create alternative options of the music that was created by humans,
Hmm.
um, that hold on to the identity and the character of those, because that's what makes it valuable.
What about
Um,
like pushing further even? I mean,
yes.
I'm not a
Yeah.
I'm not a Luddite, and I'm also not a tech bro. I'm not excited by the idea of implants. I don't,
Uh-huh.
I'm not looking for my ocular implant from Elon anytime soon. That
Okay.
said, the one thing that does intrigue me, and this will just tell you more about me than you ever needed to know, is having an implant that would allow me to understand more complexity in things. Music. Let's take music as an example. So
Mm-hmm.
if you imagine that you can hear, so there's a lot of late 20th century music and contemporary music that's almost impossible to hear because as a theorist I can find patterns and interesting connections that I can't hear with my feeble
Okay.
brain.
So you mean if
um,
you're analyzing the music and it's written down, you can find connections that your ear doesn't pick up? Is that what you mean? Like,
that's right, yeah, because
yeah.
because it's so far out of what my brain is trained to understand as pattern, as
Yeah.
musical pattern, that it's, even though I know it's there and I'm trying, and this is like pretty unusual. Once you get that far along in studying, contemporary music, you get pretty good at picking that stuff out. But I'm saying it's a lot harder than hearing patterns in Mozart, right? Like a lot harder.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
so sometimes I wonder, what if we had, some sort of augmentation that would allow us to cognize that complexity,
Mm.
and then we would have to have computers write the music then, because we couldn't if we can't even hear it, we probably can't write it either. What do you think about that? Have you thought about that?
Sure, I've thought about that a lot because I've tried to develop systems that work with me as a composer to push beyond what I might be able to connect. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, you mentioned Mozart. Like that's maybe in the Western world, that's like the ultimate balance of uh, complexity that's hearable. It's a perfect balance in many ways, and then of mathematical complexity that's very hearable, very, but also still emotional and very danceable in many cases, right? Which is one of the key functions of music. So,
I'm gonna tell
but
Bach
things,
you said that.
well, I think that I don't know if that's true, and it's arguable, but I'd prefer Bach myself probably. But anyway, the point is, I think Mozart's a great balance, and as you say, people push, 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 push for hundreds of years after, and have created music that might be very analyzable in certain formats, but not hearable, and certainly emotionally could be very difficult to get. So I think it's possible to get this to happen. I agree that if you had certain kind of implants that allows you to make musical connections more readily, that are more distant, because they exist. I mean, certainly I can create some very disparate sounds that are connected in certain ways that you may not recognize as such, but you might be able to do so if your brain could build a bigger context, could hold more specific and more accurate memory over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, even in a Mahler symphony, okay, you have 90 minutes of, related and connected modulations and key changes and movements in different keys that are related, maybe. That's wonderful, but it's hard to sit and remember that opening moment 90 minutes later after hearing so much stuff. So we don't always
It
connect it all.
and I suspect that, the less experience you have in
Mm.
dealing with music in a hands-on way, the harder that is, and it must be kind of a soup and a subconscious connection that people make. I know that happens to me sometimes when I'm not really engaging.
Mm-hmm.
Music becomes a soup. And think about, like the Italian total serialists like Maderna and Nono. That music, that's kind of what I was thinking about earlier when I was thinking about things that it's not complex conceptually, right? It's very
Yeah.
easy to learn how to make music like that.
Mm-hmm.
They had a very simple system, actually. um, Basically simple bits of arithmetic almost,
Yep.
to create these, but they used math to generate every part of the music. So the timbre, the dynamics, the instrumentation, the notes, the rhythms, everything was generated by these little formulas that they wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And so it couldn't be more opposite to how Western music, through the Romantic, was created. And so when my brain hears that, it doesn't know how to do it. It doesn't know how to process it. Doesn't know how to find those patterns.
So I think it would be interesting. I think a goal of mine personally would be to get a computer system to create music that's that complex with those kinds of connections, but has a surface to it that is still very recognizable or
mm,
familiar enough that we have an emotional opening into it. I wonder if that's possible, right? To keep,
mm,
yeah, that'd be interesting to have a new sense of
that would be
balance.
amazing.
I don't know. We're not there yet, but we're on the way. And part of that journey is thinking about music as information.
Right, because a computer can't touch it unless it's, bits and bytes, right? So
Yeah,
you have
it
to
has to be
find a way.
it has to be bits and bytes of the right kind to capture the right parts of the essence that we really want it to know
Right,
about.
because I was just reading some papers from the all the big AI companies like Google and Meta and OpenAI all have music research projects going on.
Yep.
And I was just reading some of their papers and trying to parse. There's a lot of the computer science stuff that is, beyond my knowledge in computer science for sure.
Hmm.
I could not be one of those people creating that. But what I did understand for sure is that when they're feeding music into the system, they have amazing ways of doing all kinds of things that are very difficult. I mean, these systems are incredible. And they're basically trying to feed music into LLMs right now. That's what they're trying to figure out how to make it spit out something good.
Hmm.
Um, but what they're feeding in is, and this speaks to what you were just saying, they're taking, a music file, a a, a digital file of music, like a WAV file or whatever, and they are doing some magic to it, and then they're just cutting it into pieces that are a particular length, right?
Oh, a
So
set length.
yes, a few milliseconds or half a second or whatever, and
Uh-huh.
those are the tokens that they're using to give to the system.
Mm.
So if you imagine,
Well,
I mean, it's
that's
it's
not going to
even
work.
worse than this, but if you imagine cutting text into, like, let's make an LLM and let's cut all of our text into 3-letter blocks, and let's
Ah,
give it let's give it 3 letters at a time and see if it
yeah,
can make language out of that.
that's a
And
good
the answer is
analogy.
no. I mean,
Yeah,
eh,
that's a really good analogy because it would just see, and you're saying like you remove all spaces between words and you just get 3-letter chunks and that's it. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's a great analogy because even the clumping, the chunking is what we'd say, I guess, of the letters don't even form words, which now really impair those systems. And that's what would be the case with the music for sure. If the music isn't split into musically meaningful segments, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that's kinda crazy is even if you could split it into meaningful sections, which you can,
I was going to
you
say
happen to
you
be an
can.
expert on that, but
Yeah.
once you do that, you also have to deal with the fact that, the grammar of modern pop music, yes, it's emergent grammar, but there are some pretty strong conventions in,
Yep.
like,
You can hard code
blues-based
some
music.
conventions for sure. And people
Yeah.
do this. They build systems that are kind of hard coded to replicate a style because that's what they want to do. It will never come up with something novel
Yeah,
or
it won't come up with anything
interesting.
novel, and it won't understand things that
Right.
aren't in that style at
Yeah.
all. I mean,
Right.
it will just completely break,
Yeah.
the second it give it a Mahler symphony, for example.
Sure.
Not that anyone cares, but, you know, it's a really interesting problem to say, "Okay, well, how do we break music into bits? Okay, well, that's one thing, and now how do we create a system that understands it no matter what it is, right? No matter where it's from or when it's from or what its grammar, what its cultural
Well,
conventions are."
and of course, you and I did this in a previous company that we co-founded. We worked on this exact problem, and what we found was because we were using this emergent grammar concept, many concepts that went into segmenting audio and music into meaningful chunks. And as we did that, what we found is you could feed it other noises, other sounds, and we learned this kind of by accident, but it would segment those sounds into meaningful patterns, which it then could compare and find similarities between non-musical sounds as well as musical sounds. Because
Yeah,
why wouldn't that be the case?
one of the most delightful moments of my life was when we were, the software that Greg's talking about is called Clio, that we worked on, and we were running some searches over large libraries, and at one point and it was bringing back similar results. That's what it was doing at that moment. It was, you would give it something and it would bring back similar results. And we were just sort of running lots and lots of those over large numbers of seed songs that we weren't picking. And what
Right.
came back as we're kind of flipping through and playing through, all of a sudden there was a playlist of stand-up comedy. And
Yeah.
we didn't even know there was stand-up comedy in the library. It wasn't supposed to be there,
Right.
but there it was, and this software had understood that this stuff clumped together, um, and it had generated a little stand-up comedy playlist out of this
Yep.
big giant library of music. It was
Because the
really
patterns,
cool.
the patterns of a single voice doing a certain rhythm in a pattern and then followed by audience laughter and chaos, when back and forth, all of that was seen as a musical pattern that could be pulled from that sound. And again,
Yeah,
it
and
made
that
it so that you could compare them and find similar. Yeah.
and it certainly wasn't the most impressive musical result at all. It was just delightful because it was so surprising. It came out of nowhere and we didn't even know it was there.
And that's probably something we should cover on the podcast. Maybe some examples of things that we learned and found doing that. But there's so much to cover. We should probably wrap up this episode. Maybe we should continue this broad topic in the future. I think it's pretty
Well,
interesting.
yeah. I think that
Something.
anytime you're talking about music and computers or analyzing music or even creating it, it's almost always going to be part of that conversation. So I suspect we'll have many episodes detailing
All right.
music as information.
Well, thank you very much for joining us again on Too Much Music. And until next time, take care.
Bye, everybody.